My name is Jonathan Elukin. I'm an associate professor of history here at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I teach courses on medieval history, Jewish history, and the history of the book. When we talk about secularism, most people these days seem to want to talk about the question of tolerance, and that makes sense. That is, what distinguishes Western society, or what has distinguished Western society from other cultures. And the question of tolerance is really very central. Why has the West, or different countries in the West, liberal democracies, been able to create societies that are more or less tolerant? We're not talking about absolute tolerance, of course, not talking about tolerance for criminal actions or deviant behaviors or things like that, but a society where most people can live their lives unmolested. And that seems to be a particular characteristic of Western society. So the question becomes, where did that come from? What cultural, historical, economic, religious pressures or factors were involved in creating this kind of tolerant society? The paradox is that when most people think about the West historically, they really see a society that's quite intolerant. Certainly the medieval period that I know the best is perceived in popular culture, even in the historical scholarship, as being a tremendously intolerant society. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they imagine the Dark Ages. They imagine a society ruled by kings. They imagine a society where lords have total control over the lives of peasants or agricultural dependents. They imagine a society fraught with religious conflict and religious violence. And we see that popular image in contemporary films about the Middle Ages, artwork, etc. But when we look to see what kind of society existed in the Middle Ages, we actually get a very different picture. And you have to begin with the notion of what does tolerance mean, or what kind of tolerance are we talking about? Are we imagining, or do we want to imagine, a medieval society that is a version, even in some inchoate form, of our world? Well, that's not going to happen. If we look at the medieval world to see in their own terms what kind of society existed, that becomes a more interesting question. If you look at the development of medieval society, there are moments and areas of that society that are quite tolerant. If you look at the history of the Jews in medieval Europe, it's quite paradoxical. That is, the Jews were accused in the New Testament, as well as early Christian theology, of deicide, of responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus. And Christianity's whole theological mission or theological agenda was to supplant and replace Judaism. The question then becomes, how did the Jews survive during the Middle Ages? Yes, there were certainly periods of persecution, which we can talk about in a moment, but what's fascinating about the Jewish experience is that the Jews were not eliminated from Christian society. In fact, after Augustine, the great church father, wrote about the Jews and tried to grapple with the presence of Jews in Christian society, the Jews actually had a position in Christian society to satisfy certain Christian theological needs. According to Augustine, Christians needed Jews in society because the Jews guaranteed the antiquity of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. So that it was very important for early Christian communities not to destroy Jews and the Jewish heritage. As that Augustinian position evolved, it became the official position of the church, that Christian authority could be used to control where Jews could live, what they could do, how big their synagogues could be, what kinds of interactions they could have with Christians. But Christian society, Christian government, the church, was responsible for ultimately protecting the Jews from these periodic outbreaks of violence. Now, neither system worked perfectly. So there are times in the history of the Christian West when both the church, local authorities, royal government persecuted Jews for various reasons, to extract taxation from them, to make a public spectacle, to make a public example of them. But more often than not, the authority of the church and royal and local authority was often focused on preserving the position of the Jews in medieval European society. So if we want to take the Jewish history as one example, there is a great deal of what I would say is a pragmatic, a kind of theologically inflected tolerance that existed in medieval European history. There were many different kinds of Christian identity in medieval Europe, of a whole variety of monasteries, of orders, of monks and nuns. The story of the church, in many ways, of the medieval church, is its ability to allow for local innovation in practice and theology, and then to co-opt that innovation and those innovators and bring them into the larger fold of the church. There were certainly red lines at various points during medieval history beyond which the church wouldn't go. So for example, the Albigensian movement, this dualist heresy that grew up in the 12th and 13th century in the south of France, and really became in some way a kind of challenge, a major challenge to the authority of the church and Catholicism in the south of France, and ultimately had to be resolved by a crusade and essentially ethnic cleansing to wipe out these people. That was too much of a challenge. Although one could look at it the other way to say that it was only when those people in the south of France became too powerful, became too prevalent, that the church had to take some action. So there was always a kind of spectrum, I would say, of a kind of fluidity, that certain kinds of heresies, certain kinds of challenges to Christian belief, certain kinds of Christians' identities, the Jewish communities, those could survive as long as they stayed perhaps below the radar to a certain degree, or had a low enough profile that they weren't such a visible threat to Christian authority, to Catholic authority. Once they overstepped those bounds, either on a local level, on a situational level, or on a kind of theological level like the Albigensians did, then the church and royal authority would have to take some action. But that being said, if you look at sort of the larger scope of the Middle Ages, let's say from the 5th century to the 15th century, that was an enormously long period of time, covering a wide variety of different kinds of societies, from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe, that allowed for a certain kind of variety of Christian identity, certainly a certain kind of variety in observance and ritual, both in local variations, in personal preferences, in personal habits and styles, as well as giving, at least in this example, in this issue, the Jewish communities refuge for many centuries in these societies in which they were integrated economically, socially, and in their personal interactions with local Christian communities. So when we talk about tolerance in the medieval religious context, we're not necessarily talking about a kind of linear continuity of tolerance. We're talking about situational tolerance. We're talking about tolerance within the context and constraints of a religious society. Can that model help us understand the way secular model of tolerance has evolved in the West? Certainly after the wars of religion, following the Reformation, when Europe more or less decided that we have to stop killing each other over religious questions and allowed people of different faiths to live in various communities. And then as the Enlightenment embraced those values of individual liberty, freedom, progress, etc., and built those values into 19th century liberal democracy in the industrialized West, we have a sense now that somehow tolerance comes out of secular values, and that a secular society must be, because of its very secularity, the absence of these religious principles, embrace the notion or embrace the ideal of tolerance. Clearly, we've seen secular societies, Nazi Germany, communist Soviet Union, that are not tolerant at all, even though there are no religious values there, or at least as mainstays of of that ideology. But the challenge would be to look at the constraints and context of the medieval world and to see if the secularism and tolerance that we are trying to study and understand in the contemporary world can be understood in the same way. So we can ask the same questions. Is there just one kind of secularism in the modern world? Is there just one kind of tolerance associated with secularism in the modern world? And I think those questions, just as they're very open questions and challenging questions for the medieval period, are still very open and challenging questions for the modern world. That is, there may be some societies that embrace certain secular principles of the rule of law, freedom for the individual, that make choices about limits or about how the limits beyond which that society is not going to go. Does that mean it is no longer a tolerant society? Or does it just mean that tolerance has limits even for a secular society? Or are there different kinds of secularism? That is there a kind of pure secularism that acknowledges no impact or penetration of religious values or ideals? Or is there a kind of hybrid model of a society that has secular values but also allows for expressions of religious belief as well? So in some ways, it might be better to think about, it might be better to imagine our world as in some ways closer to the medieval world. Because just as we can see in the medieval period, these hybrid constructs of moments of tolerance, periods of tolerance, contexts of tolerance, coexisting with, undermined by, sometimes threatened by a larger religious ideology of uniformity and unity, so too might there be as well in contemporary society hybrid constructs of tolerance and intolerance in secular societies, or societies that present themselves or want to see themselves as largely secular.